And we are live with another episode of Conversations. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. And I am excited to be here with part 2 of 2 with my conversation with Scott Ressler. I'm going to do an official intro here because last week we had some technical issues and we had to do some editing in the YouTube's editor, which is janky at best. So this is Conversations, and today I am speaking again with Scott Ressler, who is a cinematographer. He has also had a long career as an AC and a camera operator, shooting also second unit, and has worked on some pretty big films over the years. His link to IMDb is in the description, and as you can see here, these are some of the films that Scott has worked on. This was in last week's episode, but because of some audio issues and other things, we had to cut them out just to make it a nice, clean episode overall. And we spoke about some of these films last week, and then here we see this slide. When he's speaking about Thriller last week in part 1, that is Scott sitting behind Michael Jackson's right shoulder. You can kind of make him out, I guess, and some other cameos that he made in films that he has worked on. And we kind of spoke about the beginnings and into the middles, I guess, with Scott last week, where we talked about how he became interested as a filmmaker, and then also how he got into this whole business and everything related to it. And then we started talking about his films, and we wound up ending off here on this film, Barton Fink. And really, Scott was bringing us up to speed in terms of how he got onto the film and kind of sending his resume cold, and then having an interesting interview with Roger Deakins and sort of starting up on the film. But we did not get into the technical aspects of the film, so I'd like to start there. And with that, I'm going to bring Scott on, and hopefully everything's working well. Scott, welcome back for part 2.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here.
So last week we had a couple of hiccups, but overall we got to speak about a lot of things. And I thought, and we discussed it a little bit, that starting up this week, we could get into some of the technical and craft side of things related to Barton Fink, and then just keep moving through your career and the things that you were working on. This seems to be sort of a time when you were working as a first AC, obviously still as a cinematographer all of the time, but you were also starting to get into, which we'll talk about after Barton Fink, moving into a lot of camera operating, second unit, and things like that. So let me bring up the still image here, which you're familiar with. This is you on set, so this is the BTS shot of you. And you want to just kind of talk to us a little bit about that, and we can start to talk about some of these slides and some of the things that you were tasked with when you were working on this film?
Sure. Well, as you can see, I had long hair back then, and my first day on set, a few people thought I was Joel Cohen, who you see off on the top left corner. But that's Roger Deakins behind the camera, and this was if I remember right, it was a BL3 that we were using. Roger owned one, but I don't think we used his. I believe it was Cook lenses. It's been so long. And we had a set of these of ones that were close focus, so we could do those crazy shots you see throughout the movie where we're going into, for instance, slowly moving into a bathroom, then going up over the sink and then down into the drain. Or we did some with a band and going into the tuba horn, that sort of thing. Yeah, there's the sink. And so it was, from a focus standpoint, it was a really challenging movie, but just a joy to work on something of this high of quality. One of the things that I brought up earlier was that, in a strange way, the Coen brothers, no matter how big the movie is, it feels small in a way. they treat everything very personally, and they're very focused, and they deal with everything on in a sort of macro manner. And then they're also extremely prepared, so they tend to have the entire movie storyboarded. So they did everyone on the crew had a large binder full of storyboards for the entire movie. There's only one scene or sequence that I can remember that that they decided not to go by the storyboards, and that was, I believe, an exterior of a building on Wilshire Boulevard, like an old 1940s building, and I forget what it's for, but they ended up doing this sort of, it's hard to explain, but they called it a little journey, where they were using a director's finder, and we were constantly changing lenses for them, and we were putting marks down, and they kind of moved throughout the lawn of this building, and until they finally had worked out the shot. And it took a while, but they're not, slow filmmakers by any means. So we made our day, definitely. But it's just they have a very personal way of making films. That's kind of interesting.
Cool. So when we're taking a look at this sync shot, and you said it's challenging, can you kind of talk us through that process? Because I think it's fascinating to understand how, I guess in this case, we have Deakins, who's the cinematographer, but he's also the camera operator because he tends to operate. And that's also true of you as a cinematographer. You tend to operate a lot when you're shooting projects. Talk to me about sort of what the challenges were here for this shot and how you dealt with it.
Well, just to clarify, I mean, I'm perfectly happy to use a good operator. It's just that most of my projects that I shoot are either second units or lower budget, so it's out of necessity that I operate. But I enjoy it. I quite like operating.
Cool.
So I'll note that Roger he's a very supportive director of photography, and unlike a lot of other people I work with, and I don't mean to disparage them in any way, but some people will set a frame and say, this is what you're going to do, or they'll operate the first rehearsal, and you have to watch and hit it exactly the same way. Whereas Roger will just kind of wave his hand and say, include this and so forth when you're operating for him. So you actually get to apply some of your own creativity, which is wonderful. And he's also very supportive of his crew. And as the focus puller, he knew enough to know when a shot was really difficult. So in this case, he actually had some suggestions and brought up things that they had done in the past. And one of the things was that at the point where the camera's facing straight down, looking into the sink, he suggested dropping a fishing line with lead weights on it at marked intervals. And then as the next lead weight hit the surface of the side of the sink, you would know, okay, now we're at 6 inches, now we're at 5 inches, and so forth. So we actually did that, and it worked out quite well. And I'd heard of this technique, but I'd never tried it, and probably wouldn't have done so because it's distracting for other people if Roger hadn't suggested it. So a good person to work with. And there were other cases where it wasn't, there were no techniques I could do to make it easier because they'd be in the shot. But in this particular case, I was able to use a focus aid.
So explain that to me, because I'm sort of getting what you're talking about, but are you dropping those weights off camera and then you're just hearing them as it's sort of like a timing mechanism because you're moving the camera at a certain speed? Explain how you're using that for that shot.
I didn't explain it well.
No, I just want to make sure I'm understanding it. Yeah.
Okay. So there's a piece of fishing line taped to the outside side of the matte box. And then there's weights that are crimped to it at different intervals. And so the piece of fishing line is tucked out of the way. I think we had another piece of tape until we're facing straight down and tight enough where you wouldn't see it. Then I dropped it, and I'm still pulling focus, but then I dropped it, and it's out of frame, but it's hanging straight down from the matte box
Got it.
and just out of frame.
Yep.
And so as the camera booms down into the drain, like the weight will hit, and then the next weight will hit, and then the next weight, and so
Got it.
those are just focus marks,
Yep.
if that makes
Got it.
sense.
No, it makes total sense. Yeah, and it's good that we switched to this camera because then I'm seeing your visual, and as you're talking it out, it makes a lot more sense. So that's great. We have a couple of other frames from the movie. If you want to just talk about those quickly, and we'll move through those, and then we can get on to Lost Highway, which would be great. Yeah.
Okay. And I can talk a little bit about so the one fascinating thing about this, to me at least, was during this shot, a crane drops into, or pelican or something drops into the water to grab a fish right behind her. And I've been asked dozens of times how we did that. And it was just sheer blind luck. It just happened to occur while we were filming this. So the gods were with us, so to speak. Um, One thing, though, I'll mention about Roger in general, and this was one of my epiphanies, was that I always liked, I had an instructor who called them compound keys. It's when you film with the backlight on the same side of the subject as the key light, so that there's like a hotter edge, and then it becomes more consistent when it comes around the front. And it sort of emulates the effect of placing a soft light right by a person's face, just out of frame, because of that inverse square law. You know how the light drops off very suddenly because it's so close.
Yep.
That effect is sort of emulated in a wider shot by doing a compound key, because you have a hotter area and then it becomes darker, and it gives you that beautiful portrait look of sudden fall off on soft light. So it's something that he does fairly often, not on everything by any means. I think it's almost like punctuation. But this is just my guess, that it's a technique to really draw your eye in, to make things look more dramatic.
Cool. And then what about this typewriter shot? Was that also a challenge, or?
Yeah, very much. I mean, we did many shots of both the typewriter and pieces of paper stationary on that desk where we did boom downs. And I would, this was before the days of digital, of course. So the monitors are very soft. The video tap on a 35 millimeter film camera, especially back then. Although we always used black and white because it was sharper. But it was a very trying shot. And at times, if it were a shorter move that was linear, I would talk them into putting the camera like directly above, and doing just a simple straight drop down rather than a diagonal move, because it's easier to pull focus on it. And if the typewriter wasn't at the right angle, we would simply just adjust the typewriter, like put something underneath the legs. So there were focus tricks to make this stuff work, because I mean our depth of field was a quarter inch at most at that for some of these shots.
Do you think that nowadays, because of digital, that people who are firsts are measuring less because they get a clearer picture of what's happening? I mean, you have to measure anyway because you have to know some things, but do you find that when you look back at your career, when you were shooting on film and you had a low quality video tap, that you were measuring a lot more than nowadays?
I moved up just as digital was starting to come in, so I never pulled focus on a digital shoot. But that said, I obviously worked with a lot of camera assistants, and I saw that a lot of them were relying more and more on monitors and never even, I mean, I don't know if it's been mentioned, but I worked quite a lot on the series Dexter. And it was kind of a lonely job being a camera operator on Dexter because you had the cast on set and you had the dolly grip and you had the operator, and the dolly grip would go away between setups, but you would have to stay by camera to check the lighting and so forth. So it was they for a period they were I think actually the A camera first. Steve Herson was doing some measurements, and the B first was not. And then for some reason it switched towards the end of the series. The A camera was under this black hood at his monitor all the time, and the B first was on set pulling focus a lot. So I guess it just depends on the focus puller. But yes, definitely less measurement overall. There are definitely people who still take measurements and still like doing it the traditional way. And I think if you get thrown back and forth between film and digital, it's probably to your benefit to. It's definitely to your benefit to learn how to do that, but also to your benefit to, at times, pull focus in the old-fashioned way by the camera, because then your chops will still be good when it comes to shooting film.
Cool. So we have our first question, which is, how much time do you typically get to set up your shots before you actually start capturing your footage? I'm sure it's varied, but I just want to get your take on that, Scott.
I mean, it's project and day dependent, like with anyone. So the bigger films, especially if they're like VFX heavy, or there's a lot of complicated things to deal with, you have lots of time. I've been on shows where it's towards the end of the week, TV series where I've day played or whatever, and we're operating a shot. It's very complicated. We do many, many rehearsals. Then we sit by to give everyone a break, and then it ends up being 2 hours after the lighting is done, and we've forgotten the shot, and we get in trouble. So you have to be careful about keeping an eye on when the shot's going to happen, and making sure you rehearse enough that you're fresh by the time and sharp by the time you actually roll. But you pace yourself based on the project. So if you know you're going to have an hour, then you finesse and you do what you can to make it as good as possible, and you work ahead. You use some of that time to get ready for the next shot.
So last week we talked a little bit about some of your advice for somebody who's coming into the camera department and moving up to being a first AC. We're kind of at that point now where we're going to transition and start to talk even more about camera operating. So before we do that, I wanted to ask you, Scott, if you had any advice for people who may be moving up from a second to a first, or who just really want to learn how to be a camera assistant, a first AC, in terms of exercises or things they can do, because we'll talk about this a little later, but you're also teaching cinematography at the university that you're working at now, and you're also still a cinematographer working on projects. So is there any other advice before we kind of move into these other films and start talking more about operating in cinematography?
Well, I lucked into starting as a first, basically. I mean, I think I was a second for 2 weeks, but I would say that to get ready for camera assisting, obviously watch every video you can, read like the David Elkins book, and any resources you can get your hands on, because it's a very technical job, especially these days with digital. I would say for focus pulling, there was a remarkable focus puller whose name escapes me, Mark something, who's no longer with us, who would walk around with a metal tape measure, and he would, now you could do it with a digital tape measure, like a laser recorder, and he would guess a distance and then measure it, and he got really good at focus by doing that. So I highly recommend that. If you're a good focus puller, you'll work a lot. However, that will make it a little harder for you to move up, because there's just really a handful of great focus pullers out there. So although with digital, it's a lot of people are quite good. But for a film shoot, you really want that kind of sense of distance well developed.
Cool. So let's start moving on. Based on our conversations, we discussed it sort of at around this time, and I know we're going to kind of get into what you did on each of these films, but we're going to move over to Lost Highway, and I want you to just give me, kind of your take on working on that film.
Sure.
And then we'll just keep moving through because we have a lot of other films to discuss. And just tell us what you worked on this film, what you were doing on the film, and a little bit about the experience.
Okay, I'm going to tag one thing to the last film, which is that Roger Deakins is very generous with his knowledge. So go check his blog and he has a website, rogerdeakins.com, that has just tons of information. You can ask questions, and often he'll answer it himself. So that's a great resource. So definitely take advantage of it.
I agree.
So Lost Highway. So I knew Peter Deming through socially, I guess, through other camera people, and he knew that I had worked briefly on Wild at Heart, and he likes people who work quietly and low key and get the job done, but that have a sense of humor and also, and are sensitive, I guess. I think that was one of the words he used. And he's a low key guy himself, but definitely very good at expressing himself as to what he wants and so forth. So we had a brief interview, and I got hired. And I was the focus puller on it, and it was Panavision, 35 millimeter, and we used primarily E-series anamorphic lenses because those were mostly what was available at the time. There were other anamorphic shows out with the C-series, which are very popular, or at the time were very popular, which are an older and smaller set. So the E-series are great lenses, but they have to, because they build the lenses themselves, they test them to see what the minimum focus is, because some lenses fall apart, particularly wide open at close distances. So our particular set were all 4 foot minimum, which is not that great, but that's what we had. And we also had a set of diopters so we could do close-ups. And I have a funny story about this highway shot, if it's still up.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's up.
Okay. Anyway, so I got the job, and my very first week there, we had a really difficult shot that was a slow, wide open push-in. So basically the first 2 weeks, I think, of the movie were inside Bill Pullman's house, which was one of David Lynch's homes. He owns several homes. And it was all painted super dark on the inside. And these were, I think it's 1.9, these lenses. I can't remember the minimum stop on the E-series, but we were wide open. And there was a scene that was like a 3-minute push-in on this couple sitting on a couch watching a video, it turns out, of themselves. You have to see the movie to understand that. And what I didn't know is that they were slowly leaning in, which was imperceptible over 3 minutes. And so they are actually within minimum focus on that. And so I wasn't able to I tell. So we had to actually reshoot it. So I thought I was going to get fired because they were slightly soft. And so that got me that experience. They finally agreed to rent me the Pana tape, which was an early sonar focus tool. And that got me through the rest of the movie, since it was a really difficult movie. I mean, I probably would have gotten through it anyway, but it sure made me feel better about it. Anyway, jumping ahead to the image that was shown of the highway.
Yep. I'm bringing it back up. Yep.
Okay. Dan Neese is the oft-times Steadicam operator for David Lynch, and has been since Blue Velvet. And so Dan and I were on the hood of an insert car, and it was freezing cold out, and we had it was a Steadicam, and we were filming, I think I don't remember the frame rate, but it was a slowed down frame rate, and then the car was driving like 27 miles an hour or something like that. So by shooting at a reduced frame rate, under cranking, we were able to make it look faster. But David wanted that sense of a floaty camera, so the Steadicam was the way to go with that. But of course, it was just freezing out there, and so I was doing better than Dan because I was able to wrap myself a little bit in the furniture pad. But poor Dan's fingers were numb because they were like, I'd say 18-minute takes, 20-something minute takes.
Wow.
The undercranking, because he wanted it to be a title sequence, so he wanted it to run long. But because we were rolling undercranked frame rate, it took like 3 or 4 times that amount of time in order to make it that length, if that makes sense.
It does.
Anyway,
yeah.
Okay.
Cool. So, and I know Dan as well. So, and he's a great Steadicam operator and has worked on many films, not just Lynch's films. So, his work is all over the place. So I'm going to go through. We have quite a few frames from this. Do we want to go into some of these close-ups because we have so many films to get? I mean, we have so many films to get through. Scott,
well,
what do you think?
I'll just briefly tell one story then from Lost Highway, and you can just scroll through these images.
Okay.
They're somewhat careful about information getting out because so much information leaks from David Lynch's projects. So I can only really talk about things that were mentioned in the article in American Cinematographer. And if you want to learn more about Lost Highway, Peter Deming was very generous with the information he gave. So it's in any case, Peter was shooting at the very ragged edge often. There was an expression on set where, for instance, Peter would turn to David and say, "Do you want this dark?" And David would say, "Dark, dark." So dark, dark became the phrase of how things, for interiors especially, would be. And there was just one scene where it was Bill Pullman walking up to a mirror with the Steadicam, following him and looking at his reflection. And we did several takes, and David wanted to move on, but Peter, some instinct told him he better take another reading, and he did, and he realized he was pushing it too much. So he opened up, raised the light level just a hair, and suddenly we did one more take. It went well. And when we saw the dailies, he was absolutely right. Like the other shots had fallen apart, but that tiny adjustment made the shot just stunningly beautiful, that ragged edge quality that you can see throughout the movie. So I was just very impressed with how much the movie was powered on instinct, how edgy everything was. Also, we regularly went closer than the minimum 4 feet focus distance on that movie. David liked to roll the camera right up to their faces. So every day I'd have to turn to David and say, "David, we went out of focus." And every day he had another answer, like, "People are going to have to get used to a new kind of focus," or we'll add a buzzing sound to the soundtrack. And he actually did that shot. As it goes out of focus, it starts buzzing, So anyway, it was a great experience.
That's cool. Okay, good. So let's move on to the next film, which is The End of Violence, and tell us a little bit about that.
Well, this one I got, again, because of my connection with David Lynch's organization. So they were producing this movie, and Wim Wenders was the director, and I was a big fan, so I was excited. And I came in later in the project. Oftentimes people get let go for political reasons, and I think that was the case here. Anyway, I took over, and it was the film was being shot again wide open. I think our lenses were 1.3, lenses. So we were, I believe, movie cam, I guess, but I'm not 100% sure. But in any case, it was just a really challenging movie. This image, if it's still up, is obviously inspired by the painting Nighthawks by Edward Hopper.
Yep.
And I believe Wim Wenders has used that image in another of his films more recently, because I saw a still from a different movie where they recreated the set. So obviously he, like millions of people, are obsessed with this image. But it was a great experience. Wim is, an incredible filmmaker and a brilliant man. And I got to work with him and his wife and niece and a French director of photography. And it was just a new experience for me, very international film, very low budget, very challenging, but, I keep saying a great experience, but it really was.
Great. Okay, so now we're going to move on to this next film, which is The Straight Story. And this film, you were not an AC on, and this is we're going to see a lot of your frames when we go through this. So tell us a little bit about this film and sort of how you came into this and what you were doing.
Sure. So this one, it was another one through the Lynch organization. I got called up because they were going to be shooting 2 cameras, and they couldn't. It was tight budget, so we were going to be using David's Mitchell Mark II camera for the second camera, which would also be used for second unit. And he didn't trust that many people with the camera, and the main unit camera assistants, who were out of Florida, I believe, didn't want anything to do with that camera because it was older, and they're Panavision people. They're father and son team named Bill McConnell, I believe. And anyway, so Freddie Francis was the director of photography, and though it was a great experience again, it was also a bit contentious just because I was hired by the director, so I was always having to constantly try to prove myself on it. But it was what I would do is run off and shoot the second unit while they were shooting one camera, which was most of the time. But maybe 5 times or so, I'd come in and do B camera. And then a few times I actually pulled focus on 2 shots in it. And for reasons beyond my understanding, I did get the credit as the B camera focus puller. I think they were worried about something about the union, but I don't understand. But I really only did 2 shots. Most of this footage, aside from the lead actor, Richard Farnsworth, all these frame grabs are from my second unit. So it was a lot of nature. In fact, David Lynch's daily command to me was nature, nature, nature. And we had some specific things, but we did a lot of shooting of unusual animals in farms from a slow-moving vehicle that was supposed to represent the tractor that he was driving on. And David saw it and found it too sad to see these animals behind barbed wire. So he cut all of that. But there's a good number of my shots in the movie. And I got to shoot the iconic shot of the tractor, against the sunset. And no one was supposed to take, there was no still photographer. In fact, there was no makeup artist or wardrobe or hair people on the film. They wanted the actors, it was sort of an experiment. So they wanted the actors to do that themselves. But I think in the case of one actor, there were people for that person, but otherwise we had no one. So this ended up being the poster for the movie. They blew this frame up and used it as the movie poster.
Cool. So on this film, you're bouncing a little, but you're definitely tasked with being second unit primarily, it sounds like. Can you just talk about, even though as with everything related to filmmaking, it depends on the film, the television show, and all of that stuff. But we're losing a little bit of your hair there. You're getting a little bit of a haircut right
Sorry.
now. No, it's fine. There we go. Yeah, that's good. So Can you talk to us about what somebody who's getting assigned to and moving into second unit, what that actually means? Because obviously it can be a small second unit, it can be a gigantic second unit, depending on the size of the film that you're working on. But on a film like this, are you going out with an entirely separate crew? Do you have a first and a second? Were you just operating, or were you basically second unit DP, and that's where some of the tension? Just can you define for us some of those things so that people who are not familiar with that have some understanding?
Yeah, it's basically, I would say that if you use a light meter, you're the second unit director of photography, in my opinion. But especially if you do any lighting on your second unit. In this case, it was an extremely small crew. It was myself and one camera assistant, and he was driving the van. So and I ended up doing a lot of it myself, building the camera, since it was the Mark II, and it is a Mark II, isn't it? I believe so. We ended up having an issue with the camera where, for some reason, the mechanism, the drive mechanism, got damaged, and we have no idea how. So we ended up using the B camera, the Panaflex, after a while. So we switched. But it was that was another, I believe, anamorphic movie. Yeah, it was anamorphic. And we had a Panavision had put a Panavision mount onto David's camera for him. And so we were, but eventually I was just using a Panaflex.
Great. I want to mention to everybody who's here in the chat, questions are welcome. They are encouraged. David had a question just because you mentioned Dexter earlier. Did you shoot any of the shots for the opening sequence? And then no. But please, questions, bring them into the chat. And then I wanted to ask you, for second unit, is it almost always MOS in terms of second unit, or does it really, again, depend on the film? Because sometimes second unit you're going out with, above the line, you're going out with, some of the talent too, who's there for sure. What's usually your experience over the years?
I would say it's still massively MOS, but on bigger films like stunt units and so forth, sometimes they'll bring a sound person to get reference sound or car driving sounds or whatever. And if it involves the lead actors, it's usually pickups rather than second unit. But occasionally they cheat and do it that way.
Got it. Okay.
But so I would say relatively rare.
Okay, cool. So now we're going to go on to a small film you worked on. So let's go ahead and take a look at this one. This is one of my favorite movie posters, by the way. I had to, when you gave these to me, this was the one. So we're now going to talk about Austin Powers. And of course, I was being facetious when I said a small movie. But tell us how you came onto this, and also, what you were doing here, because this is a transition for you to a certain degree, I would say, especially when we're talking about working on big features.
Correct. Yes. So I had done, with Peter Deming, I had done the previous two. I had done the first Austin Powers movie, and then we weren't available for the second one, but we did 2 weeks of pickups on it. And then so we were offered this movie, and the director, Jay Roach, who I had actually gone to school with, but I didn't know that well, offered to have me be the B camera operator on the show. And so I still started it out as the focus puller, but shortly after that moved over to David Elkins, who's still Peter's focus puller to this day, a great focus puller. And so I was the B camera operator for probably 60% of the movie, something like that.
So I want to talk to you about operating a little bit, because I think this is a good time to do that. We've talked about, being a camera assistant. And I think a lot of people at least think they know what a cinematographer does in terms of their responsibilities and being over, that camera department. But when you move into a B camera operator on a film like Goldmember, and you're tasked with pretty high responsibility level, and it's a big picture. What is it that you need to be doing? What is it that you need to know to be a great camera operator on features and episodic? Because I think there's something that's expected at least, and it's more than just being able to, you know, to move the camera. In fact, you're not always the one moving the camera. Can you talk about being, a camera operator on that level?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's different from between A camera and B camera, at least to me, and different from features to television.
Okay.
Television, what's that?
No, I said okay. I'm listening. I'm interested. Yeah.
The in my opinion, on TV series, you really get to know everyone on the crew and cast right away, and you're dealing with them personally. There's almost a degree of ADing, of assistant directing, involved in being a camera operator on a TV series. You're Some of the organization of the set is on you, and whereas on a feature film, especially the B camera operator is if you're not working constantly, like if it's not like a 2 or 3 camera show for everything, you're more sort of in the background. You're more invisible. But the A camera has to be assertive. You have to really know when to pipe in. You want to be there the instant that they say, okay, moving on. You walk over and talk with or at least listen to the director and the director of photography talking. And depending on your relationship with them, you can submit your own suggestions. Often, especially on smaller projects, you'll be involved in the blocking and screen direction to make sure everything cuts correctly. So you really need to know your screen direction, stage line, camera blocking really well. Often camera operators know it better than directors do.
Hmm. So on a film like this and your B camera, was it primarily a one camera, and then you would come in? Like, when would B camera come into play on a film like this?
Oh, anytime there was a stunt or multiple characters, more than two. So quite often on Goldmember, because it was a bigger film. The original Austin Powers was fairly low budget, and I'm pretty sure it was union, but it was still low budget, and it did so well on video that the budget for the second one went up significantly, and the budget for the third one went up enormously. So we had a big film. The sets were huge. If you still have the image of Austin with the 2 women up,
I'll bring that up. Yeah. Let me
yeah,
bring it.
okay,
It's
yeah.
there.
The woman on the left, I believe, is Carrie Ann Inaba, who she was one of the dancers in my early feature that we talked about, which is called, well, it has various names, but it's called, it's the Monster Mash movie.
Right.
It's also called Frankenstein Sings. And she's now one of the hosts on one of the Dancing with the Stars.
Right.
So she's done very well since then.
Great.
Just a little bit of trivia. So I'm sorry, what was the original question again?
No. I think you answered it. I'm also really seeing this thread, which is not uncommon when it comes to working in the industry, that it's really the people that you work with and that working relationship which creates this thread, if you don't screw things up and you're good at what you do, where you find new work and you get onto other projects because of the work you've done on previous films and other work that you've done.
Yeah. Hopefully you work with people who are loyal, and if you've done a good job and not upset anyone, then bring you on to the next job. So, so getting in with a good crew. I mean, a lot of people think that they want to do features, but then they do a television series and they realize that, like, they start a family, or for instance, just don't want to travel that much. So having like a 7-month or 8-month run on a TV series is perfect. So it just really depends on the what your needs are personally. But with a TV series, you can get in thick. And I know people who've worked, 10 years, 9, 10 years on one series. The camera assistants on Dexter, at least the A camera assistants, worked the entire run of the series, and that was, I think, 8 years. So it was a really good gig for them. They had job security.
So when you're working in television, which is very different than working on a feature film, I'm just going to ask you now, because you're kind of talking about this stuff. When you are an AC, you're a camera operator, you're part of that crew, you're a DP, a cinematographer. How is that feeling in any one of those positions because it's very common in television that you have this rotation of directors who are coming in. Some only come in for one episode. Some might do a couple of episodes back to back. Then they might come back a year from now. They might never come back. What is that like, being on a set where you have that family, but you've got this constant rotation of, yes, you've got the writer, producer kind of role and, that creative thing. How does that work? I mean, how do you deal with that as a family when you've got all these directors?
Well, I mean, the good thing for camera people is if there's any conflict, it usually doesn't affect you directly. I mean, there might be some peripheral things, but if the big decisions aren't part of your circle, you don't have to worry about them. But I would say you get used to that pretty quickly. I mean, I think most directors come in, or at least a lot of directors come in, a bit intimidated because they know the series has been going for a year or 6 months or 8 years. And so they're thinking, oh, are they going to judge me? But I would say crew that works regularly knows that when they come in, it's part of their job to make the new people feel comfortable and to give them the rules in a non-insulting way,
Yep.
To let them know this is what we normally do, but you have to leave them room to flex their own creative muscle and put their own taste into it. So it's really not. You learn pretty quickly how to make that part of the day-to-day work.
Great. So we've got a few more films to get through, and I think we'll go just a slightly faster clip. But I want you to give us a little anecdote or something about these films, because I want to make sure we have a little bit of time to talk about the whoa, I did a little zooming thing. I didn't know about that nice feature in and I just had the image there, and I just went like this with two fingers on just to get ready for something, and all of a sudden it shrunk down the image, and here we were behind it. So So I'm just going to bring up these frames. I'll mention the name of the movie. I'll have you talk about something, because what I did want to say before that happened was I want to make sure we spend a little bit of time circling back to you coming full circle, but now actually teaching cinematography, and then anything else related to to your career. So Heart Huckabees, and we've got our first frame up.
Okay, so this another film I did. In fact, it was my last feature to full focus on. And kind of a fascinating experience. I don't know if any of you have seen the famous clips online that leaked about a year after the film was made.
Sorry about the mic bump. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, those don't represent the norm on the film. Luckily, those were just the two crazy moments. But the director David O. Russell is a interesting person, and he's a I actually quite liked him. We had very controlled environment, and having someone as imaginative and unusual in their manner of working didn't really affect us directly in any way. So other than for focus pulling, of course, it was really challenging because there was so much improvisation and we were anamorphic on that show. I believe, yeah, I'm pretty sure we were anamorphic. In any case, the anecdote I have on that, since the most famous anecdote is available on YouTube. Just look for I Heart Huckabees. Is that at the end of the film, I was offered the job of shooting the video, which ended up being attached to the DVD, and it's with John Bryan and was the artist, and we had several of the cast members in it. And it was just supposed to be this kind of wacky, people going back and forth kind of thing in different outfits, and a fun idea and everything. And David O. Russell was directing it. And so we show up, and there were no lights at the place where we were told there'd be lights, or there hardly any, and we had to make do with what there were. And for David O. Russell, I think life is a social experiment. And I mean no insult to him. I did like working with him and would gladly do it again. But I think he sometimes does things just to see how people react. And so we were all set up to shoot a wall, towards one wall. And then he comes in and turns 90 degrees and said, "No, I want that wall." And we have to roll in 5 minutes. So suddenly the whole crew is scrambling. We had to light this massive area. So we just swung a big hard light around and moved the track and started rolling while we were literally putting more lights in a diffusion while the camera was rolling. We had 3 cameras going. And so that video didn't really get to any point where I could say I was proud of the lighting until maybe halfway through the shoot. So it's not, there's a clip of it on my reel, but it's not, my finest moment. But it's, it was still a really interesting job to work on, and something, a war story.
Yeah, cool. One question we have from Neil, which is taking us back to at least release date 2001, which is Mulholland Drive. You were working as a first AC on that. Anything you can? I don't have any frames from the film, but anything you can tell us about working on that film?
The cast, it was, again, small. It was supposed to be a TV pilot originally. This is all public knowledge. And the cast were really great. And our department hit it off really well, particularly with Naomi Watts. I would do crossword puzzles with her every morning. And she wasn't very well known at the time. But she's just a really lovely person. And so that one, more than most jobs I've done, has been a family atmosphere, even though it was tricky and low budget and again, extremely challenging. It was, that one is one of my favorites to have worked on. And then close to a year later, I was doing another movie with Peter Deming in Prague. It's a Johnny Depp, Jack the Ripper movie called From Hell. And my plan was to spend about 6 weeks traveling through Europe after the film. And then like a week before the end of the shoot, Peter turned to me and said, "I just heard from David. We're going to do pickups on Mulholland Drive, and so it'll be in 2 weeks." So I had time to run to Rome for like 3 days and then fly back. So I lost my vacation, but it was well worth it. I really wanted to work on all of Mulholland Drive, and that's when we expanded it into a feature. And the whole meaning of it, well, I guess I don't really know. I have no idea. David is as much a mystery to people who work with him as he is to outsiders, as far as what his meaning is to anything. And so I know better than to ask. That's one of the films I'm most proud of having worked on. It's such an amazing film. And when I saw the final cut, I was blown away. I was just nothing. I had no idea where things were going to go. Oh, and we weren't allowed to read the pickup script because so many of David's scripts had leaked that it was the only way you could read it is if you went to the office and read it in front of one of the other employees. And I wasn't privy to that. So I had no idea that it had become, it had some shall we say, graphic scenes in it. So I was really surprised when we were filming them. They came out of nowhere for me.
Cool. Well, there you go, Neil. That's some background on that film, which I think is great. So let's get into just a couple more here, and we'll bang through these pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And we've got next film is Shopgirl. So tell us a little bit about this.
Right. So I had moved up, with GOLDMEMBER and a few other projects. I was trying to only operate, and I got a call from, but I wasn't in a position where I could turn down a full feature as a focus puller, and I got a call from a production office saying that Peter Sushitsky, who's this amazing English cameraman who shot things like Return of the Jedi or Empire Strikes Back, rather.
Right. Yep.
And I think that's right.
And Rocky Horror, right? He did Rocky Horror.
Yep. And as well as just a lot of John Borman and David Cronenberg movies. He was. I had worked with him for maybe 2 weeks on a movie called. I'm forgetting the name, but it was Joe Pesci, and is a sort of a loosely based on the life of Ouija. And anyway, I was apparently at the top of his list of people to hire. So I got called in, and I told him that I was available, and he wasn't in town yet. And then he called me like a week later and said, "Oh no, you're only on my list because you've been on it the longest. You're at the top of my list, but I actually had someone I'd hired." And I was like, "Oh, no big deal." And then I told him I was operating anyway. And so he brought me on to be essentially the B camera operator to make it up to me. But I got A camera credit because he operates for himself. And so it was really interesting. Not a ton of B cameras, so I ended up running off a lot and doing establishing shots. And the cast was amazing in this film. So I was really glad I did it.
Okay, so now we have a question from Tess in Edinburgh. Love to know about working on the Scream franchise, and these are also films that you worked with Dan Neese with, right? And if you could just,
on the first one, yes.
On the first one, he was the Steadicam op, right? So tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll move on to a couple others, and let's get into some edumacation stuff too.
Okay, I'll go pretty quickly through this. Actually, I didn't work with Dan on the first one because there was a political incident, and we took over a little after halfway through. So Peter and I and the rest of our crew came in late on Scream 1.
Interesting.
And so Dan was actually with, I think it was Mark Irwin, shot the original footage and did a beautiful job, and as did Dan. But Peter had someone else come in. I'm forgetting who.
Okay.
And that was in Northern California. And so we ended up doing the next two. And then Peter, after I moved on to operator, Peter did the fourth one. I didn't. But they were great. They were very, very difficult because we had primarily less experienced cast members who weren't that great at hitting marks. And here they're doing extremely dramatic scenes, and we're anamorphic wide open yet again. And so I've got an inch depth of field on people who are a foot off their mark and jumping around like crazy as they found out that their best friend has been stabbed or whatever. So really tough. And unfortunately, a lot of people we brought in for B camera got axed because they just weren't ready for how almost a documentary style there was to the way it was being shot in some cases. But lots of nights. Wes is a really good guy, the director, Wes Craven. Very pleasant to work with. Very, I would say, like a journeyman director. Like he always knew what he wanted and just got it right away. Very efficient and pleasant and clever. And so I don't know what else I can say about it. I just I'm really happy I did them. A good bunch of people, but night exterior shooting for months of each film is really difficult.
Yeah, and there's so much action in those movies. I mean, there's just so much movement going on. I'm sure your job wasn't easy. Okay.
No one.
All right, let's go into now. We've spoken a little bit about Dexter. Is there anything else that you want to tell us about working on that series and some of the challenges that you had?
Yeah, I'll be very brief on that. I mean, it was also a very nice bunch of people. The cast is wonderful. I just love the cast, and the director of photography for the majority of the series was Romeo Tironi, and he started also shooting another series, True Blood, I think, and they moved him up to operator or to director, as did Dexter eventually, I believe. And so Jeff Juror finished, I think, the last 2 seasons of the series, maybe 3. So anyway, great bunch of folks. Very tricky as an operator. I was B camera initially, and then there's a kind of a changing of the guard on that show for various reasons that didn't have to do with me. And so I ended up coming in as a day player, but also coming in to shoot inserts and occasionally second unit. So I did, I want to say, 6 years of inserts on that show. And wow. So it was just I'm very detail oriented. So shooting inserts was really great for me.
That's great. Okay, cool. So last project that we're going to talk about, which is this, reboot, and tell us a little bit about this and what you did on Twin Peaks: The Return.
So they were so happy with the way things worked out with my little 2-man second unit on the Straight Story that they wanted to repeat that, but this was a little bit bigger budget and a little more regimented. So I had a Seattle, or I guess Washington State-based first assistant cameraman with me, who also drove the truck, which is done sometimes on location shooting. And then we would scale the size of our crew depending on what we were shooting. I also supervised the drone unit. But it was completely, again, nature, and various informational inserts too.
Awesome. So I think it's a good time for us to, we're at about the hour mark, and I want to make sure we at least have a bit of a conversation about you as an educator and somebody who's taken all of this knowledge. And, it should be stated that you're not somebody who is at the end of their career and you took a teaching job just, to have a job doing that. You're a working cinematographer. You're still working on projects, and you talked to me actually before we went live that you're going to be color timing a film that you worked on, and you're still shooting projects. And I'm sure that there is an enormous workload with what you're doing, but at the same time, it does afford you times or gaps where you can go on and work on projects. So you come full circle. Obviously, a few years later, you went to film school, and now you are in the position of teaching cinematography. And not only have you not been doing it for an incredibly long time, and I'm going to throw a lot at you here, and then you're just going to talk, if that's okay with you. But now we had this little thing. I think it's a pandemic, and I know that it's affected my daughter and her education in university. So let's talk about, what your responsibilities are at teaching cinematography and some of the challenges and the things that you're looking at, and maybe also talking a little bit about, and I mean today, teaching cinematography in sort of this landscape. And then number 2, how you're dealing or not dealing with this pandemic, and how you look forward to next year and the possibility of the fact that maybe there aren't people in the classroom. Maybe it's a different way that you have to approach it for a short period of time. So I'm throwing a lot of stuff, and I'm just going to let you talk about stuff, Scott, if that's okay with you.
Sure, of course. So I started teaching about 2 years ago, but I had done various workshops and panels and so forth over the years, AFI, and when I was in high school, I taught animation briefly at the Rice University Media Center in Houston, Texas. And so I had a little bit of experience, but enough to know that I really love teaching. I really enjoy it. So this came up, and it was at a time where things were a little slow, and this particular university, University of North Carolina School of the Arts, allows for time off for projects because they want their faculty to still be relevant in the industry. They still want them working and to know current techniques and so forth, current technology. So, so I took the job, and it was far more involved than I ever expected. So I had to catch up really quickly. And each semester, I'm significantly more prepared than the previous one. And so I kind of feel like I'm still not at my potential yet, but hopefully soon. And another thing about the school is that at that point, there weren't really many faculty members who knew digital. Some of them were older and had been directors of photography, maybe with digital, but didn't know any of the technical side of it. So I had to bone up on my technical so I could teach it. So I teach primarily second year sophomores. So with the current situation, it took us all completely by surprise, pants down, all that. So I had, in my primary class, which again was the second year, I had planned all hands-on for the end of the last 6 weeks of the semester. So I was done with all but maybe one of my lectures. And so suddenly I had to generate a lot more material and figure out ways of giving some sort of learning outcome to the classes. And that's to do it with no preparation and having already given everything I had intended to do for the entire year. I had to try to be creative really quick, and I was only semi-successful, I think. But now I'm going to be basically spending the summer preparing for the chance that we're remote teaching the entire time. So what we're doing, I mean, none of this is secret. We're looking into emulation software for lighting, for like previs, for blocking, and some other areas that are too early to talk about. But there's a really nice lighting simulator for still photography called Setalight that we might end up getting for the entire second year class and maybe even the first year class. And there's a great little overhead view blocking app called Shot Designer, and we're also looking at some previs software. Right now, we're kind of leaning towards Shot Professional, Shot Pro, but that's still undecided. And so we'll be able to at least talk about blocking, do setups, have the students do it at home, and turn in projects based on the software. So we'll have interaction. They'll be able to actually create. And then with Set Designer, or rather Setalight, they'll be able to actually do some practical lighting. I believe that what it does is you set it up in a slightly lower rendering quality, and then you hit a button and it renders it out via ray tracing, I assume, but I'm not sure. So the shadows are relatively realistic. The only problem for us is that it doesn't have a particularly strong library of backgrounds like set pieces and so forth. So that would be really helpful because obviously you're not just lighting people, you're also lighting, location sets, so forth. So we're having to rethink everything. And right now, a lot of the thinking is towards using software to fill in the holes. But obviously, nothing will replace true hands-on. So when we come back, if we're not there for the fall semester, when we come back in the spring, the thinking is that we'll have workshops to give an intense degree of hands-on before these students get into making their student projects. And we've always kind of prided ourselves on being a hands-on school. You get your hands, in most cases, you get your hands on a camera the day one in your first year. And I do 1 to 2 hours of hands-on in my 3-hour second year class every week. So you make films constantly in the school. So not having that potentially not having that in the fall semester is tragic. It's really difficult, but for everyone, especially the students. But we're doing the best we can, and we think we can have a meaningful learning outcome from the techniques we're considering.
Cool. And are you going to deploy equipment to the students, or just have the expectation, because nowadays people have access to DSLR, cameras, mirrorless cameras, digital cinema cameras? Do you find that, I'm assuming anybody who's going to film school at least has a camera that's beyond their smartphone? But do most of these people have basic lighting instruments, or how do you deal with that challenge, or has that not even been a discussion yet?
Because I teach the class solely, it's just been a discussion in my own mind, really, this particular class. But I have I have two sections of that class, and then two other classes this coming semester. Mm. We don't have a definitive solution for that yet. I mean, for things like blocking and just general concept things, we'll probably use whatever camera you have. We'll have them just use, cell phones, or if they have a mirrorless or DSLR. And I just won't judge them based on that, which is the only fair way to do it. Yeah. And then as far as lighting, I mean, we have one student who's been doing beautiful work at home. He's been doing a series of commercial emulations, product photography and so forth. And he's using household light bulbs and aluminum foil and stuff. So it can be done. And so we still have 2 months of discussion to go. But in a perfect world, we'd buy them all cameras and a couple LED lights and ship them to them. But we are a state school, so I'm guessing we don't have that kind of budget. But we'll see. I don't really know.
And when you're teaching cinematography at this level, are you designing a program that's preparing somebody to work on not only narrative projects, but are you teaching them so that if their interest is in documentary or commercials, or is it well-rounded, or are you just focused on, okay, so this is scripted content and that's what we're doing?
It's a good question. We are primarily a narrative program, but we are trying to open that up, do more commercials, definitely more documentaries. We're considering having a full documentary class. But I definitely have a day of discussing documentary technique for the second years, and I'm going to probably expand that some. In fact, I'll probably add maybe for this, I'll add a documentary project, like a 3-shot documentary project to the second year class, so that we can so that people can kind of get an idea of how to do that. And they might have to do in-camera editing if they don't have access to editing equipment. I don't really know. Yeah. So it's all kind of up in the air, as I said. But yes, that is something we're going to step up on, giving a more well-rounded education that prepares them more. We have a full-time North Carolina-based gaffer / key grip working at the school who teaches equipment handling and some lighting. But we could really step that up more too. So that's something I'm trying to bring the school, and now some of the other new faculty are trying to bring the school more into the modern age in some senses. But it's always been a really good school. So it's just my preference, really.
Got it. Okay, cool. I want to ask you a question that's about cinematography, which I think is overwhelming to a lot of people, myself included. Because we talk about cinematography as this sort of, 3-parter. It's composition, it's lighting, it's camera movement. It's obviously a lot more than that as well. But when people start to move up to larger productions, and this is asking you as both somebody who has experience doing this and also as an educator, and they stop just working in smaller defined spaces. So they're shooting in interiors in the house, they're shooting in the backyard of somebody's, house or at a location. And we start to scale up to these bigger spaces. You're tasked with, as a cinematographer, director says, okay, so the next shot is going to be an action sequence, and we're going to close off 5 city blocks, and we're going to have some rooftop stuff. There's going to be some stuff down at street level. Then my head starts to explode, and I start to think about not only being the person responsible for that entire department, but how do you plan for that? How do you take that concept of what you've learned on this small scale and scale it up? And is there any advice besides using some of these tools like CineTracer, which are out now, and being able to use some of these virtual tools? What can you give as advice for somebody who's approaching that and also has to be responsible for sort of running that whole department and everything that's being done and the creative side of it? Now, that's a big question, but it's just something I'd love to get your take on.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I can tie some other stuff into it. For instance, Roger Deakins has this thing, at least on Barton Fink, and I saw a little of it on. I did some days on. Actually, I did some months on Jarhead, where he rather than going to bigger lighting units, he just scales up the number of smaller units sometimes. And I'm not. You'd have to talk to him about why he does that, but it's stunningly beautiful. It's just a lot of rigging for grip electric. But there was a sequence in Barton Fink, I think one of the opening scenes, where he was lighting a wooden, like an older wooden restaurant interior, and he had this massive cluster of light bulbs in there, and it was just regular household bulbs, but like hundreds of them. So there was banded just covering the walls, and the rigging took a long time. It was a lot of work. Whereas had he just used 2 or 3 big units, it would have been a much faster rig. So I guess the answer is that in some cases you take what you know and you just scale it up. I would say I was lucky enough to have worked on some fairly big projects. So I could look and see how people were lighting big night exteriors. For instance, some of the directors of photography I worked with don't like blue night scenes or even blue-green, so they shoot everything with tungsten. They just get the biggest tungsten lights they can get, and it's beautiful. I mean, it really looks great. So for someone, having previs, I mean, in my opinion, I love CineTracer. I'm playing with it now, but I think it's not quite ready for mainstream. But there are some programs that you could probably do that kind of work in as a previs tool for lighting. Obviously, Setalight isn't quite there yet. You're in a studio for that one, so that wouldn't be ideal. But so typically what people do is they'll do testing. They'll especially if you don't have experience on big movies, if this is kind of a big deal for you, what a lot of people recommend is that you hire a gaffer that is very experienced, and then with the promise to your regular crew that you're loyal to, that, okay, I'll bring you on the next one, but I really need someone who knows more than I do on this one, that knows a lot. And, they're going to be mad. They're going to feel that you've bailed on them. But, in order for you to help the crew that have been loyal to you, you have to get more work and you have to do better. So sometimes it's a necessary evil. So I would say, do all the research you can, hire people that know more than you about that kind of lighting, and they'll give you advice. And when in doubt, just take what you already know and scale it up.
And I would assume that when you're bringing on people who know more than you do, especially if you're the cinematographer and you're bringing in, a gaffer, and then they're probably bringing in their electrical department who they've worked with, or at least that would be ideal for them, that there's still, as you said, that homework part, and you can't walk in without a clear idea of what it is. You might not know the instruments that you want them to use. You may not know that you want them to use a particular sized HMI or how many of those, and how you want to do that. But you have to be able to communicate very clearly what type of lighting you're looking for and where you want that lighting to come from and the direction of that lighting, and give them some sense of ratios that you're looking for. And I guess that could be a lookbook, that could be reference frames, that could be some of these programs. And you definitely don't want to come across as amateur hour and just say, well, I kind of cobbled this together and set a light, which is a great program, to learn lighting and lighting faces and things, but would you say that that's true, that you still have to, when you're over a department, even if you're hiring people who have more experience in a particular area, you have to come in with a level of confidence that you and the director have a clear idea of what you're trying to accomplish visually, and that you have to be able to communicate that effectively?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. I've worked with some fairly neurotic directors of photography as an assistant, and but they always eventually know what they want, and then it becomes their look. But the thing you learn is that even if you're intimidated by someone, that has more experience than you that you're hiring, most people just want to work, and they want to they want to make sure that everyone's happy. And so, I guess I was a little hard on inexperienced gaffers in part one, but my general experience has been with experienced gaffers is that they're really there for you. And if you just say to them, I haven't done a lot of this kind of work, and so I might be relying on you heavily when you're doing the job interview, you'll see what they're going to be like. If they're okay with that, then 90% of the time they'll stick with that, and they'll be very cool about it. Just don't throw them under the bus. Don't make sure that you are confident that you have your taste applied. Because most of them won't say, this is how you do it. They'll say, here's a couple ways we could approach this. And then you can say, I like this mostly, but I really like less fill and blah, blah, blah. And then you can make it your own.
Yeah.
So just be, as you say, confident, but be open to suggestion. Some of these guys are unbelievable. We had Mike Bauman, who has just an insane resume of feature films, including Phantom Thread and Iron Man and so forth. Was a guest he's a gaffer, but he may be a director of photography soon. He visited us via Zoom for our graduating class. We always have a lot of meetings with industry professionals, and the guy couldn't have been nicer. He's so helpful. You can tell what he's like on set. He's super supportive. He gives lots of options, and as long as your idea has merit, it technically has merit, he's going to back it up completely and may make suggestions to even make it better. So, don't be afraid of these guys for the most part. Ask around, research people you're going to hire to find out what they're like, because there are people with amazing resumes who are nightmares to work with.
Sure.
And sometimes you can get a clue about that by looking at their resume and seeing if they've worked with the same directors of photography multiple times. Some of them haven't.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. And I think it's great advice to remind yourself that when you are the director of photography, that you generally have some say in terms of what that department's going to, build out as. You already have a pretty clear idea with the director in terms of what you're going for. And as long as you have some semblance of being able to read people and their personalities, you'll know in that interview whether or not there's going to be a problem. Usually, instinct is your best thing to fall back on. And if your instinct says this person is arrogant in the interview, then the chances are that on day 1 or day 20 in that project, something's going to blow up and it's going to become something that's going to work against that production. And as we all know, whether it's a small budget or a large budget production, it only takes one to sink the ship. I mean, it really can just take one person on the crew. Shazam's asking a question: do you approach low budget jobs the same as high budget jobs? I would answer that, and I'll let you answer that. And I think we then have to wrap it up, coming up on the hour and a half mark. But first of all, I'm so happy we did this second part, because I think the information is really valuable and it's a great conversation. But for me personally, I don't do a lot of high budget jobs. I wouldn't mind doing some more of them in the future, but most of my stuff sort of sits in the low to mid tier. But my approach is never different, because what I'm looking for is I'm looking for collaboration. I'm looking for people that I would enjoy working with over and over again. And ultimately, we're just, creating content and hopefully telling a story that's going to have some sort of impact, whether that's corporate or it's narrative, whatever the, documentary. So I don't approach it any differently. I just say we have a little bit more money to work with, and I can hire more of the people that I like to work with, and we can support the client in a better way, hopefully, with that kind of stuff. And maybe we'll get slightly better gear for this one. But my approach is never that different. You're coming from a different area, though, where you're working with different directors and things. So when you go in as a cinematographer onto a higher budget job as opposed to a really low budget, do you approach it any differently, Scott?
Well, I'm sort of like you in that it's usually mid to low. When I do bigger budget things, it's usually second unit or inserts or something like that. So I don't really, there's no way to approach it. I'm just sort of plugged in. So, so it's not quite the same thing. But I mean, I would say that, yes, I approach it the same way mentally, but obviously my equipment approach is different, because you can't afford everything that you want on the low budgets. So I tend to include lower cost, very flexible lighting, like my old paper lanterns that I was talking about, or have saved me in a pinch many, many times, and things like those flexible light mats and things like that. So bicolor lights, because you can't really, you don't always know. You don't even always get to see the location before you start shooting on low budget. So I would say that medium budget, I tend to be not rigid necessarily, but a little more formal in my thinking. Whereas low budget, I tend to be keep my mind open and try to be ready for anything.
Great. With that, part 2 is over, and I'd love to talk to you in the future, Scott, about maybe coming up with something that's less career focused, which is great to go through all of this, and then maybe we can have a future conversation that's specific to a particular area related to cinematography, and we can break some stuff down even more, which would be fantastic. This has been really a pleasure for me, because we met a number of years ago through a mutual friend. We had a nice conversation, but we didn't really get to connect after that. So this has been a nice catch up with all of our prep and everything else. And I appreciate you sharing your knowledge. And please, everybody, check out all the information in the description below to find out more about Scott, what he's doing, what he's worked on. And Scott, thank you so much for taking your time.
Of course, and thank you. It's really been interesting, and it's forced me to kind of reappraise some things, which has been great. So I really appreciate it. I'm finally recutting my reel thanks to this. So take care, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much, everybody.